In episode 1, a guy named Santos is going through some of his photos from his time at uni. He says that because he knows what came after those photos were taken, it fills him with a sense of doom to look at them. It's autumn 2009 at Sarah Lawrence College, and we see a montage of kids partying and just being social, sitting out on the lawn, taking selfies. Another guy, Max, tells us that the slogan of the school was, "You are different, and so are we." This is the kind of mindset that attracted this group of kids to this school and to each other. So there are a couple of interviewees in the beginning. Dan, Raven, Juliana, Gabe, Santos, and Max are among some of them. In the autumn of 2010, the group decides to live in the same house. At first, they had a great time, and then Santos talks about meeting this girl named Talia, how he went up to her and asked her out, and then they became a couple. She wanted to be a lawyer to help people like her dad, and apparently she spoke about her dad a lot, even at parties, and Raven says that it got kind of weird. Apparently he was a special military James Bond type, and Talia would talk about how he was unfairly imprisoned. Shortly after, he was released from prison, and the group agreed to let him sleep on their couch, given that he didn't have much right after being released. So Talia's father, Larry, came to the house and he spoke for hours and everyone was transfixed. He spoke about how he was in the CIA, and he also somehow had photos to back up a lot of his claims with all of these important people who were out to get him. So Larry was fighting the good fight. He also made it seem normal, his being there, and he became kind of a dad figure in the house, sometimes cooking for the students. One day, he holds a meeting revealing his philosophy, some kind of self-actualization thing, be who you are, or the best version of who you are. Apparently, he also had the skill that he could help process repressed memories. Santos mentions that as a 19-year-old, this was appealing, the idea that you could find the answers. The first person who got one of Larry's so-called treatments was Isabella, Talia's best friend. Remember, Talia is Larry's daughter. Isabella was quite a recluse and she stayed in her room a lot. At one point, Larry was in her room overnight, and at the time the belief was that they were just bonding and talking. During one of the holidays, Isabella's mother tells the interviewer that Isabella didn't want to come home, and she at the time had put Larry on the phone, who told her mother, I don't know if you know this, but Isabella was abused when she was younger. This is news to the mother, of course. At the time, Larry and Isabella had expressed that Isabella might harm herself if she comes back to that life. All of a sudden, Isabella became transformed into this vibrant person, and she came out of her shell. Santos then asked Larry if he could talk, and he revealed some information about his family. His mother worked a lot and his father regularly stepped out on her in their marriage. Larry's advice and guidance resonated with Santos and he felt understood. Raven says that at the beginning she and Claudia, another friend, would joke about Larry always being there and how weird it was. Over time though, Larry and Claudia started to talk a lot, and at some point she believed that she had schizophrenia. The others were really taken aback because they knew nothing of this. And of course this was very sudden. Larry sudden. Raven had said at the time that this needs to stop. Larry doesn't know what he's talking about. But Claudia insisted. And Raven says that everyone kind of thought that he was weird in the beginning, and then when Larry would get them on their own, one-on-one, suddenly they were drinking the Kool-Aid, so to speak, and very defensive when questioned about it. Dan and Raven were dating at the time, and they were having some issues in their relationship at some point. Santos mentioned that maybe Larry might be able to help. Dan was open to it, and so he and Larry met for coffee in the city. Larry got to working on some of Dan's insecurity issues. So Dan always felt a little bit worried about his sexuality, that he might be gay, and Larry told him, I know for a fact that you're not gay, so don't worry about it. This talk obviously went on for hours, but that is the gist of it. Anyway, Dan said that he felt a relief then, that he didn't have to struggle with it anymore. I mean, if Larry said that he wasn't, somehow then he wasn't. Larry then told Dan that Raven was in his way. Larry made Dan call Raven, who wasn't receptive to the help that Larry was offering everyone else, and because Dan was, that was where their paths as a couple split. As Dan and Larry were walking to get into a limo down the road, the other housemates, Dan says, were all just sitting in the limo, and it seemed as though they were just sitting there waiting for 6 hours, as in waiting for Larry and Dan to finish. Dan's parents talked to the cameras, and while they felt that Dan was enamored and enthralled by Larry, they thought that he'd just made a friend and that there wasn't any danger. That summer, Larry then invited Dan to stay at his apartment in New York. He also invited Santos to help renovate the apartment. Even Santos' parents met Larry and they were impressed by how smart he was. So the group, Claudia, Santos, Dan, Isabella, Talia, and Larry are all regularly at this apartment on the Upper East Side. Everyone would sleep in the living room, and Isabella and Larry would sleep in the bedroom. According to Santos, it was weird, but Larry's explanation was that Isabella needed a lot of help. She was still vulnerable. Seeing how they all changed for the better over the year, they all took his word for it. Then Larry started this boot camp thing by waking them up early in the morning to train and get their lives together. He also started telling them that people are very sexual beings and that society is too puritanical. So everything was built around them gaining their sexual confidence. One night, Isabella and Dan hooked up, but he says that he got the feeling that she'd been sent out to him. Dan does mention that before this, Larry did ask him if he found Isabella attractive, and Dan felt that it was just the right thing in the moment to say yes, because that's what he felt was expected of him. Dan says that over time it felt like he was being enrolled in the sexual education. Larry would play Gregorian chants and guide Dan on how to pleasure someone. It eventually grew into Dan, Isabella, and Larry having sex together, and he says that his brain locks up at this point. He did feel like he'd been brought into the fold, but yeah, he'd always have to leave the room afterwards because he wouldn't sleep with them in the bedroom, and he wondered what went on. By autumn 2011, Santos says that they would go to school during the day and to Larry's apartment at night. At this point, it's not mentioned whether they have separate housing, but it seems as though they've moved into the apartment full time. Santos says that because Larry had helped him so much, he wanted his sister to meet him because she was kind of sad. Yalitza, Santos' sister, was really lonely. She had no friends. So she went to the apartment that she says that Santos and the others were staying that summer, and she saw how everyone was able to live together. The apartment was full of life. And she also didn't feel so alone because everybody else in the group was working on themselves. Raven says that she was sure that there was an unhealthy attachment there, but she couldn't tell what Larry was getting out of it. By the spring of 2012, Santos' sister says that it felt like it was a little too chaotic and it wasn't tenable. Larry would cut up Adderall and give it to them to keep them awake, and he would keep them working, doing chores in the apartment. He'd coach them into thinking they'd made mistakes, and after a while they'd just believe it. Their thinking was, well, Larry wants the best for me, and he says that I did it, so I must have done it. They would sometimes doubt it, but they just tell themselves that it was true. Santos says that around that time, he didn't really know what was true and what wasn't. Anyway, Larry would interrogate Santos in front of the others, accusing him of things. He even made Santos make a list of things that he'd damaged in the apartment, and Larry wanted payment for all those items. Santos says at one moment he was so anxious that he literally wrote down everything that he'd ever come to contact with in the apartment. To repair the damage, he started asking for money then to repair the supposed damage to Larry's items. His mom pawned some of her jewelry, she gave him $750, and then his parents also asked their friends for thousands of dollars in loans to help out their son. Then Claudia sent an email to everybody in uni, including the dean. It was a confession about rumors that she had supposedly spread, and her taking those rumors back. She was now saying in this email that Larry never hurt anyone. Their old friend saw through this because she never actually said a lot of what she confessed to, so it was all Larry, trying to get ahead of his own bad PR. Anyway, one of the guys reached out to check in with Claudia, and she said that she was fine and that Larry was the only reason that she was alive. In episode 2, some of Larry's friends agreed to talk to the camera, and he's shown as the successful businessman with a great family life. That's who he portrayed himself as. One day, Larry tells his friends then that the FBI wants to indict him. Then the papers come out with his financial fraud type crimes. He loses custody of his children, and he blamed one of his friends for setting him up. Rudy Giuliani was somehow roped into it by Larry as a person who was co-conspiring against him. Larry was eventually sentenced to 3 years in prison for kidnapping his daughter Talia. Around this time, he was on this quest to prove his innocence, and a man believed in his cause. He invited Larry eventually to stay on his couch after he got out of prison, and eventually Larry ended up taking over the whole apartment. This is the apartment that the students eventually arrived at. The man says that he started spending less time at the apartment because that meant that he wouldn't have to deal with Larry. Larry did tell him one day when the man asked about the students, he said that he was building an army. Juliana, one of the ex-roommates who didn't get the Larry treatment, didn't really see the others as much. They went to classes, but they were otherwise withdrawn. Raven says that they'd sometimes cross the street when they saw her, even though they did invite her to the apartment. She did not trust it, so she said no. Back at the apartment in New York, The interrogations would continue. Larry started suggesting that somebody named Kerrig, one of his old enemies, was helping the kids conspire against him. He would keep them awake for hours, and Santos says that eventually he just started making things up, like stories about cops, anything just to avoid getting into trouble. Larry was also recording these faked confessions to eventually blackmail the kids with. Isabella, however, was kind of seen as Larry's partner, so she was spared the worst of it in front of the others, although we can just imagine what was happening behind closed doors. She was really hurt, though, when another one of Santos' sister, Felicia, came onto the scene. Felicia is extremely smart, full rides to Ivy League medical schools, and Felicia comes to visit. Felicia is a psychology student, and when she comes to visit, she really connects with Larry and they start dating. Eventually, she goes back to LA. She's about to start her residency in psychology, but Larry wants her back. And suddenly there's this threat on her life in LA that he'd made up because she's dating Larry, and she comes back, a shadow of her former self. More on this California thing later. She's drawn into this conspiracy, certain that her parents were trying to send people to kill her. Somehow Larry has brainwashed the kids into thinking that their father abused them and that he was a drug dealer. At the time, though, Santos's parents sold almost everything because they were scared of Larry. They borrowed money from everyone they knew as well. Anyway, Dan started having doubts. He was starting to be less sure of what was happening, and he couldn't make sense of the Felicia story, how people were after her in LA and how her parents were supposedly in on this plot. His parents had also written him a letter at that point to reach out, but his dad knew that Larry would try to shut down their communications. Then Dan was interrogated, and it's bad. There's even a video showing Larry with pliers in Dan's mouth, and Dan is getting beaten up by Larry. Dan recalls how Larry hurt his genitals as punishment, one night then completely beaten down mentally. He says that he went out onto the roof and he just lay up there. He then realized that whatever was going on wasn't good, and he allowed himself to consider that maybe Larry was the bad guy. Soon after, he just took his things and left. He signed up for an extra class. He got 2 jobs so that he could have legitimate reasons to say that he was busy, that he had no time. He rejected every call and he cut them out. Larry told the others that Dan gave up on his path to happiness. Santos says that he remembers thinking that he wished he could leave, but he felt so stuck now. He was then placed on medical leave from school, and all he had, Santos, was Larry. In the spring of 2013, some of the girls graduate. Raven confronts the girls who are still in. She tells him that they're in a cult, and they just laugh it off. That summer, the group all ends up in North Carolina with Larry. He wanted to fix up his father's property, so he had the kids working for him. He would lock the fridge so they couldn't eat, and he would just be tweaked out on Adderall. Felicia was breaking down badly at this point, and the relationship between the sisters was very bad. Larry had purposely placed a wedge between them. Larry then gets this mysterious rash, and Yalitza is gaslit into thinking that she poisoned him and Felicia 2 years ago, and that's why Felicia was also deteriorating. Yalitza now is overcome with guilt. One night, she goes out into the night and she walks away. She runs across the highway, she takes a train to New York City, and she says that she tried to figure out a way to live without her siblings and her family. Remember, she thinks that she hurt them, so she doesn't think that she can call them. By 2015, Santos says that there was no sense of time. Felicia is not functional, and Larry makes the siblings turn on each other. One day, Santos says that he just leaves with the clothes on his back, that's it. Felicia tells him that Larry is going to be so mad, but Santos says that he just can't do it anymore. Shortly thereafter, Claudia makes this website with a video of her confessing to poisoning all of her friends with mercury. She's obviously being coached by Larry. She's clearly in distress. Following some kind of trail using the website, Raven found a website of an escort page, and it's Claudia's escort page. She and Max went to the police and told them the whole Larry story, but the police laughed them off. But they went to another alumni of the university who starts putting together a story. They get another reporter for the New York Magazine, and the lies are unraveled. Larry was never in the military. They found some psych evaluation that said that Larry wasn't able to really be tested in normal settings because he was highly manipulative and hostile. Larry then contacted the reporters and threw Claudia under the bus, saying that she did everything she confessed to, and he didn't know that she was escorting, but he supposes she did because she wanted to. She had given him hundreds of thousands of dollars, according to the reporters. Anyway, the New York Magazine breaks the story. Santos was called in to talk to the police, and they played back a recording of Larry being abusive to him. And that's when it hit him that he was in a cult and he was being abused. Claudia then called Dan after the article was published. They talk and commiserate. She also had a wake-up call after seeing the article, and she left as soon as she could. At this point, the parents are still wondering if they'll ever see their children again. Santos's parents had lost 3 children to this cult, and after 5 years, Larry was evicted from the apartment. Larry, Felicia, and Isabella, because it's just the 3 of them now, moved into a friend's home in New Jersey. At this point, there's been no mention of Larry's daughter Talia, by the way. Anyway, it's at this home in New Jersey where Larry gets arrested. Shortly thereafter, Isabella releases a video telling him that she's sorry about all this, it's not fair, and that he didn't do the things that he's been accused of. In episode 3 in February 2020, the news is still running with information about Larry and his sex crime charges. In a heartbreaking scene, we see that Felicia's parents leave a note for her at the house. Remember, by this point, their 2 other kids, Santos and Yalitza, have made it out, but Felicia's still in the cult. Isabella's mother tries to write her too, but Isabella doesn't respond. The parents haven't lost hope though. The filmmakers eventually go to the house in New Jersey after a few weeks. Isabella and Felicia have agreed to talk to them. Felicia shows the filmmakers around the house. She still believes that she was poisoned and that Larry was a good support system for her. She's definitely lucid and she sounds coherent and happy, but it's just that the things that she's saying are weird. Like she'll say things like they lock their fridge to keep their food safe from strangers. She cheerfully shows the filmmakers around the garden, and she says that if it hadn't been for Larry being her husband, she doesn't know where she'd be. She says that she loves him very much. I had to pause and take a breath at this point because her cheerfulness was just very weird to see. And I wonder if or how she could be broken out of this delusion. Anyway, she and Isabella are kind of like sister wives as well. They talk about how they were questioned by the police, and it was frustrating to them that the prosecutors kept on saying that they were victims and they don't believe that they are. Shortly after this, the girls moved out of the house, and some months later, Isabella reached out to the filmmakers. Isabella's in Staten Island, New York at this point, and she says that Felicia said that she'd been legally advised that they shouldn't live together. She shows a shirt that she bought for Larry, and she also says that the prosecutors could also bring charges against her as a willing participant / co-conspirator. She doesn't know what to do, but she still very much believes in this relationship with Larry and that he's innocent. Felicia also gets in touch with the filmmakers. She lives on her own now. She says that she had Larry telling her what was real for so long. She sometimes doesn't know what's real and what's true. She genuinely doesn't know what the truth is. She says that it's been over 5 years since she's seen her family, but she has photos of them and she's brought them out in her home. She's processing the things that Larry told her, and she starts talking about some of her childhood memories, and she self-corrects and says, no, that's not what happened. That's what Larry said happened. So she's very aware that she's not a reliable narrator. She says that she knows that certain memories don't come naturally to her because they were planted by Larry. So at this time, Felicia is faring a little better than Isabella. Isabella talks about how withdrawn she was, how she didn't fit in. She grew up poor, so even just going to the grocery store with Larry and letting her have what she wanted, well, they bonded. The filmmakers ask her if she's ever done something that she didn't want to do, something compromising for Larry, and she says no. Felicia is driving around the Bronx looking for her parents. She's excited, but she still has Larry's voice at the back of her mind. This is the closest I think I'll ever get to seeing someone work on deprogramming themselves out of a cult, and it's deeply fascinating. These Felicia parts are also a relief for me because I initially thought that Felicia didn't make it on account of her not being on camera in the first half of the documentary to tell her own story. Anyway, back to the Bronx. She's in her car, she's seen a glimpse of her mother, but she's not ready yet, so she doesn't go out or say anything. She says that her goal now is figuring out what's true, and she has this folder system, and she starts to figure out how things went wrong. How did she go from being on the cusp of living this successful, independent life to this? So actually all the questions we as the viewer are asking, she's asking herself this as well. She says that as the older sister, she did feel pressure to be strong when she and her siblings were growing up, but with Larry, she was allowed to be vulnerable. Remember, she was weeks away from taking her exams to be a full medical doctor, and that's when the plot happened. You know, that plot of Felicia being in danger in California and Larry made her come back to New York. to protect her. So she talks a little bit about this time in California. Her job is stressful. She works long hours, 12 hours a day. And at this time, Larry is calling her, talking to her, scaring her, and she's growing increasingly paranoid due to a lack of sleep and stress. After a few weeks, he eventually gets her to believe that she's in danger, and he gets her to New York. She says that she's a Harvard Columbia educated physician who had started her psychiatry training. And somehow she finds herself in this throuple situation with Larry and Isabella. Anyway, she got dismissed from her job. Larry tore up her documents from her residency and he threw them out of the window. Then she says she just turned her mind off because she couldn't handle it all. And she acted out, kind of like a child. She says that he took everything from her. It was just him and there was no rest of her. Isabella now has a job at an Amazon warehouse. Felicia says that at first Larry applauded Claudia going into escorting and giving him the money. But once she stopped giving him money, he blackmailed Claudia by making that tape. He tried to pressure Felicia to help him blackmail her siblings as well, but she refused. And so he manipulated Isabella into helping him do his bidding, and in order to get Claudia's payments to continue. The filmmakers gently confront Issy, they sometimes call Isabella Issy, about Larry's abuse of Claudia, and she says that it never happened, even though she was there. And Felicia says that Issy did have moments of not wanting to do it anymore, but Larry pulled her back in. There's footage of him being physically abusive towards her. At this point, Issy explains that she has 4 charges against her: sex trafficking, extortion, money laundering, and racketeering. Her attorney has reason to believe that she isn't competent to stand trial to defend herself, and anyone can kind of see that she's pretty far gone at this point. She's still very intelligent and she can string sentences together like a person who has presence of mind, but she's been utterly brainwashed by Larry. Eventually, Felicia calls her mother and it's a tearful phone call, but Felicia is smiling. They agree to meet and she bursts into tears after the call. They finally meet after years, and after a very emotional greeting, her mother asks about the other 2, Santos and Yalitza. Felicia says that she's on it. I found it really interesting that she was the first one to find her way back to her family, just because her condition seemed so much worse. Anyway, this is the most incredibly moving thing I've seen in a long time. Isabella says that a psychiatrist concluded that she is medically fit to stand trial. Again, she's perfectly coherent and she's able to understand and articulate everything about her case, so I get it. Anyway, she says that her lawyer decided to drop her as a client eventually due to a disagreement in legal strategy. She reads out the psychologist's note and the psychologist basically just said what I did. Santos says that in social situations after he left the cult, he had to try and avoid talking about his family or why he didn't finish uni. He says that he was in the shelter system. Felicia and Santos then started talking again, and she says that she also wants her other sister back. Felicia and her mother go to Yalitza, who says that she can't open her front door. They talk through the door and Felicia just tells her that she loves her. Her sister responds that it wouldn't be a good idea for them to talk right now, but she loves her too. Yalitza talks about the incident of Felicia knocking on her door, and she says that she'd been missing Felicia, but it was triggering and she was afraid. She also wasn't sure if Felicia was still in with Larry at the time. Sometime later, both Felicia and Santos come over and the 3 siblings have a meal together. Isabella feels like there's something wrong, but she doesn't know what to do. She realizes how much trouble she's in. It's heartbreaking to see how incredibly lonely she is, because obviously Larry had completely isolated her. She still thinks about a future though, where she and her kids, Larry and Talia, just watch TV, and she says that that gives her comfort. Felicia is grateful that she's out free, but she admits that some of the Larry conditioning is still there. She continues to process and she's optimistic. She says that she doesn't want Isabella to go to jail because she would use this as a shield to be angry and she won't confront the reality. But if she doesn't go, she might have to deal with what happened to her and obviously start to heal. In the end, all 3 siblings and Claudia testify against Larry in his trial. Claudia is reunited with friends and family, but she chose not to participate in the documentary. In 2021, Dan published a book about his experience. Santos started a new job and he lives with his family. Yalitza graduated from Columbia University and is pursuing a career in the arts. And Felicia works as a management consultant and she hopes to get back into medicine one day. In court, Talia, Larry's daughter, was referred to by prosecutors as Larry's co-conspirator, but no charges were brought against her. On April 2022, 12 years after meeting the students, Larry was sentenced to 60 years in prison without parole. Isabella stopped communicating with the filmmakers, but she did later plead guilty to money laundering, and she publicly condemned Larry for the first time. In the letter, one of the things she wrote was that she now recognizes that Larry hurt and used her in a way that also caused harm to others, and she said that she was deeply sorry. And yeah, that is the end of the documentary. Thank you for watching.